Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, I thank you for this opportunity once more to contribute to this Appropriation Bill 2025, Mr. President. This being my fifth response to the government. And Mr. President, I hate to break the news to you here today, but this will be my final response to the government as a member of the 6 opposition senators on this bench, Mr. President. But I don't want you to be alarmed, because within a year, Mr. President, I will be joining the 6 on this side as we go on that side to present the budget presentation, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, I also want to take this opportunity to congratulate the leader of the opposition who not only responded to a failed budget in the other place, Mr. President, but, Mr. President, she appeared to be a prime minister coming in as she rolled out some of the best plans to take this country forward for the next 5 years, Mr. President. So, when I see the Minister of Works and Transport, who I'm glad he has just returned, so I'm glad he can be here to hear this. When he said that Senator Mark had no plans for him, Mr. President, I merely have to ask him to go back to the lower house and he will see all the plans of the UNC as we take government, Mr. President. Mr. President, I also want to congratulate my colleague, Senator Wade Mark, who completely exposed the failed economic plans by this Minister of Finance, and as well as the collapse of the labor market. And, Mr. President, before I go further and leave Senator Mark, I want to stick a small pin there, Mr. President, because I must also recognize, Mr. President, that my colleague was fostering quite a bit of information with him today, Mr. President, that he primed us all up here today to show the Bacchanal and the Balizé, Mr. President. And if there was ever a time to see the Bacchanal in the Balizé today, Mr. President, we only had to see the Honourable Minister of Finance stand up on a standing order on his own colleague. Mr. President, I say no more when it comes to that. But, Mr. President, this government has come here year after year using various titles to a budget presentation. And this year is no different, Mr. President. They have come here to say what this year's title is: "We are steadfast and resolute, forging pathways to prosperity." And, Mr. President, how troubling it is that 10 years later, this government is now coming to us to tell us about pathways to prosperity, Mr. President. Mr. President, if a UNC government was still in power, we would have not lost prosperity. We will be basking in prosperity today, Mr. President, and that is the truth. Mr. President, but I want to say, instead, when I look at steadfast and resolute pathways for pathways to prosperity, instead of steadfast and resolute, Mr. President, I see a government that is indecisive and weak. And instead of pathways to prosperity, Mr. President, I see a government that has come to this country to put pain, chaos, and calamity on the citizens of this country, Mr. President. Mr. President, this is the PNM's 10th budget in this term, and it's been a year where they come once again with these grand, lofty plans, lofty statements, broken promises. And what are the people saying? We are hearing it from the various civil society, chambers of commerce. We have said it, Mr. President. Even a former PNM minister has indicated how this budget was yet again a failure and brings no hope to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. President. Mr. President, the people are fed up with the PNM because of the last 10 years. They have devastated this economy and put it into decline. They have put people into suffering, Mr. President, and we have simply experienced a decade of destruction under this government, Mr. President. So while the Prime Minister is telling us that we should hold strain for 3 more years, Mr. President, I'm saying to the population, you don't have to hold strain for 3. Just hold strain for 1 more year, Mr. President, when the United National Congress, led by Kamala Persad-Bissessar, puts this PNM into the political graveyard, Mr. President. But, Mr. President, before we get there, we have to understand how we got to the point we are here today. So, Mr. President, the Minister of Finance in the other place, when I was listening to him on TV, said our economy is stronger and more resilient now than it was before COVID-19. We heard a different story here today. He said we're in trouble. But that is what he said, Mr. President. He also said that Trinidad and Tobago was experiencing 3 years of consecutive growth. That was the boast. 3 years, Mr. President. But you see, the reality often tells a different story from this PNM. Firstly, allow me to congratulate the Honourable Minister of Finance for finally using the correct measure in GDP, which is real GDP, instead of trying to hoodwink the population using nominal GDP, Mr. President. So he finally did that, Mr. President. But he did it for the last 3 years. And I just find it interesting that he only quoted the last 3 years coming out of a pandemic to say that we have had growth between 2022 to 2024, Mr. President. And it is quite obvious, Mr. President, if we have had a country that has been locked down, brought down, and shut down for 2 years under this government, you must expect some level of economic growth when we reopen. But you see, Mr. President, I don't stop at 3 years. I take it way back, because it's a decade of instruction under this government. Let's take a look, Mr. President. The CSO reporting of real GDP gives us the actual measure of our economy. And real GDP in 2015, under a UNC government, was at $187.5 billion. That's what it was. And then in the last reading, Mr. President, with a decade of this destruction, the PNM's last reading for real GDP was $150.3 billion. Mr. President, this government has collapsed the economy by 20%, Mr. President. That is the fact. Mr. President, when it comes to jobs, the CSO tells us that between 2015 and now, we have lost up to 64,000 jobs under this government, while Kamala Prasad-Bissessar put on 50,000 jobs in her 5-year term. When it comes to debt, Mr. President, from the point that the UNC left office, central government total debt outstanding, according to the central bank, was $78 billion. Mr. President, hold on to your seat. The Central Bank Economic Bulletin for July 2024 indicates that total debt is now outstanding at $141.1 billion, Mr. President. This PNM government, in the 9 years since 1962 independence, has almost doubled our debt, our total debt, Mr. President. Mr. President, last year, our debt to GDP ratio hit 70.9. And in a review of the economy, Mr. President, we have been updated, and we've seen that they've grown the debt to GDP by 5% to 76% debt to GDP, all the while debt continues to rise. Mr. President, let me remind this country that when we left office, we left debt to GDP at 44%, Mr. President. 44%. So this PNM government has increased debt to GDP by 30% in their tenure. Mr. President, the government continues to exacerbate the debt issue for a decade, and then comes to us to talk to us about a $5.5 billion in deficits that they are presenting. But I say to you, like I said last year, if this government really took it serious to pay back bills such as VAT refunds, such as all the billions owing to contractors, and not play accountant with our revenues and expenditures, I put it to you that the deficit in this country will be surpassing $13 billion by the end of this financial year, Mr. President. I put it to you. But, Mr. President, when we look at manufacturing, the government not only says questionable things about the economy, but they speak a lot about manufacturing. The Minister of Trade and Industry, I listened to her in the other place. I didn't get the opportunity yet to hear her. But she said that manufacturing is doing well. But you see, facts are a very stubborn thing, Mr. President. I have the numbers here. The facts of overall manufacturing sector GDP at constant 2012 prices in 2015 stood at $30.3 billion under a United National Congress government. Mr. President, and now today, it has fallen to $25.8 billion by the latest measure from the central bank. But hear this one. Even before the pandemic, Mr. President, it had dropped to $27.6 billion, which is higher than today, Mr. President. So when the Minister of Finance says we are doing better today than we did back in 2019, as he said in the other place, I say, show me where. Because before the pandemic, it was better. It has progressively gotten worse under this government. Mr. President, manufacturing GDP has basically fallen by 14%, or $4.5 billion since PNM come into government. And this is worsened by the billions of dollars of foreign direct investment that has exited our shores under this government. Mr. President, and how And when you consider these indicators, how damning they are to the economy, you ask yourself the question, how does this Minister of Finance, or how does the government deal with the shortfalls in these revenues? Because we would think diversification, we'll think of new streams of revenue, but no. How this government has dealt with the shortfall in revenues, what? Remove subsidies. Seeing fuel go up some 6 times, Mr. President. They remove grants that Kamala Persad-Bissessar put, like the milk grant, the baby grant. They've reduced school feeding program. They have reduced expenditure on certain parts of our expenditure, of our education, like laptops, taking away laptops, closing the gate, reducing funding on gate. But there's one thing they like to do more than anything else to get that revenue, Mr. President, and that is to implement new and increased taxes in this country, Mr. President. Mr. President, in their 9 years, they've increased Green Fund levy. They've increased business levy. They've increased corporation tax. They've put VAT back on 7,000 food items that Kamala Persad-Bissessar removed it from. They even implemented a tire tax, Mr. President. That's what they've done, Mr. President. But I can't make this up, Mr. President. So citizens are now trying to survive in this failed economy. And you know what they come to do, Mr. President? They come now to implement the dreaded property tax. Let me say for the record, Mr. President, that in the 5 years that Kamala Persad-Bissessar was Prime Minister, she never increased one single tax, and she never implemented one new tax, Mr. President. Mr. President, and let me echo the sentiments of the opposition leader when I say that the United National Congress does not support the implementation of this property tax in any shape or form at this time, Mr. President. And we join the thousands of citizens, suffering citizens who are finding issues with the way in which the tax is being collected, as well as the flawed evaluation process being used to arrive at the tax value. Mr. President, we see P&M chaos foisted upon citizens of this country when they haven't provided enough places to pay this tax, not providing online options to pay the tax, forcing the Honourable Minister of Finance to rush here and and extend the deadline for the tax to the end of December. Mr. President, we see that. But, Mr. President, citizens are also questioning the valuation process and the methodology used in receiving the valuations on their properties, Mr. President. And they are also questioning the quality and the persons who are actually assessing these properties, whether they are experienced enough to do so. And I tell you why, Mr. President, because I need to remind this Senate that the United National Congress, we received that document in our mailbox, Mr. President. And this document, Mr. President, I remember it highlighted the flaws on how this process was. We have in our possession, I have it here, I can't show it to you, but I have it here, this memorandum. But we have in our possession an internal memorandum from the Valuation Assistant 3 Committee to the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Finance, dated November the 12th, 2018, regarding a complaint with respect to the hiring procedure and the contract position of the Graduate Valuations Surveyor 2 on the Ministry of Finance Valuation Division. These are the men and women who are coming out to assess your property and tell you how much your annual rental value is. Mr. President, in this was a lengthy document. The qualifications for graduate valuation surveyor was made very clear in that document. And after outlining the qualifications required by a surveyor for this property, the memorandum goes to state this, and I'm going to quote now, Mr. President. None of the candidates invited to interview possessed the successful completion of the final examination of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. It goes on to say, this is a fundamental prerequisite at the level given the duties and responsibilities. And then it goes on to say that all applicants should have been disqualified from the interview and the position re-advertised, seeking persons with the proper accredited degrees for a valuation survey. Mr. President, not one single one of those valuators that went out there to judge the value of your home is currently properly qualified to do this job. Not one. And knowing how unqualified the evaluators are, the stories that I hear now make sense to me. I have heard stories, Mr. President, where you see a fellow living in a wooden shack on a land getting $90,000 in annual rental value, Mr. President. I have heard stories of some persons who are getting 2 and 3 valuations in their property, and none of the valuations are equal. Some are drastically different from each other. Mr. President, I received 2 valuations of my property. I have it in my hand. I can't show it to you. I'm happy to bring it up to you after. But Mr. President, these 2 valuations, you will not believe, hold on to the arms of your chair, $100,000 difference in evaluation from the first valuation to the second valuation in the annual rental value. How can you make a mistake like that of $100,000? Mr. President, most of the citizens of the countries have not had valuators come into their properties. No one has entered my properties. I don't know if somebody took a ladder and climbed up on my tall wall and looked through my window to see how the inside of my property looks. But I know that when a bank is lending you money to buy a property, Mr. President, they send accredited valuators like Lyndon Scott, like Brent Augustus, to walk your property, to inspect your property, to give you a valuation. But, Mr. President, I challenge anybody to tell me who came inside their property, Mr. President, and valued and looked and walked through their property to see their toilet broken down and their kitchen in a mess. Mr. President, furthermore, the government has committed such an injustice to the people of Trinidad and Tobago when they have just gotten over 50% of the roll, Mr. President, and come now to charge 50% of the citizens of this country when the other 50% don't have to pay nothing. And don't talk to me about this thing we call valuations or assessments on commercial and industrial properties, Mr. President, because they haven't even started that process. So you have industrial and commercial properties that exist within the same neighborhoods as these residents, Mr. President, who are depleting the resources and wear and tear on the infrastructure of that neighborhood, who are requiring the same benefits from the corporation that the citizens are requiring, but yet they get away scot-free, Mr. President. So I am calling on this government to tell us, because that is the elite nature of this government, Mr. President. Let the poor people suffer and let all the big people and them get away scot-free. So maybe somebody could stand up here and tell us who is the friend and financier who is being protected from this property tax, Mr. President. Who is it? Mr. President, let me tell you something, I will tell you this. This tax is simply unfair. It is simply unscrupulous, and this tax is undemocratic, Mr. President. It is undemocratic. It's oppressive. And when the United National Congress comes back into power, Mr. President, very soon, we are going to ask that tax. That is our given. One of the first matters of business. Mr. President, let me move on very quickly to the manufacturing sector. Time is flying. And once more, Mr. President, I stand up here in a case of déjà vu. I stand up here, Mr. President, as though I'm listening to a stock record, Mr. President. We have a Minister of Finance who is boasting once again about the increase in the non-energy manufacturing sector, while attempting to gloss over the fact that overall manufacturing has declined. But not only overall manufacturing, but non-energy exports have declined in this country. Mr. President, I stated already that we saw a 14% decline in manufacturing overall. And I want to go further to tell you about non-energy exports, because they boast about it. I have the numbers here. Non-energy exports in 2015, Mr. President, non-energy exports were $2.64 billion. And in 2023, non-energy exports drew just $1.89 billion. Mr. President, that is a decline of non-energy exports of 29%. So, Mr. President, even though facts are a stubborn thing, they must try to stop the cherry picking to try to impress the nation. Everybody knows the true state of this economy, Mr. President. Everyone knows it. Mr. President, the government, which is clearly not serious about manufacturing, has returned to the Senate with promises of prior years. We come back, we hear once more about special economic zones. We hear about investment promotions and trade facilities, the hundreds of millions spent on these empty industrial parks, Mr. President. We hear a lot of that. We hear about the Trade Promotion Agency over and over. And all of these ideas have been repeated, Mr. President, or delayed, Mr. President, or have cost overruns, Mr. President, or have simply just not been implemented. That is what we see, Mr. President. That is what we see. But that just shows us on this side and many in the business community how completely disconnected the Honourable Minister of Finance and the Minister of Trade is from the realities of the situations impacting the manufacturers in this country. You see, Mr. President, every businessman in this country today can attest of how difficult it is today to conduct business in this country. How seriously difficult it is to even survive in this environment after 6,000 SMEs have shut their doors, Mr. President. Right? Yes, I'll keep repeating it. I'll keep repeating it. Facts are a stubborn thing, Mr. President. Mr. President, the government boasts about manufacturing surviving, but this is not the result of any initiative coming out or any fertile ground laid by this government. I agree, non-energy manufacturing increased, but you know why, Mr. President? It is because of the tenacity and the hard working and the risk taken by the private sectors in this country who are fighting not only to survive, but to grow in this environment. That is why we are seeing it. We are not seeing it because of any initiative by this government. Mr. President, again I say facts are stubborn things. But how much the government may come here and bluster about manufacturing sector and diversification, the numbers say that the key industries have been in trouble for a decade, Mr. President. The biggest challenge of business, and especially for the SMEs in this country, you know what that challenge is? They could come with all the programs they want. But unless they fix the ease of doing business in this country, we will not see businesses properly prospering. And I saw one page of saying ease of doing business in this 5th edition of the Red Book of Fairy Tales, as Janti calls it, as my Senator Lakshmiyal calls it. And you know, I expected to see so much more. I see one thing about TT Biz, nothing else. Mr. President, I want to remind everyone that it was under Kamala Prasad Bissessar when the last Ease of Doing Business Index was done in 2020 that we placed, that Mr. President, that this government placed at 105 in the world. And when Kamala Prasad Bissessar was in government in 2015, we were at 76 in the world, sorry, Mr. President. 76. And we don't need this measure, even though they discontinue it, we don't need the measure to check this, because we know it's gotten worse. If we had a measure, it would be we'd be worse than 105 in the world. But what are the 4 key areas, what we call the 4 P&M crisis of killing business in this country? Mr. President, there is the port crisis, there is the foreign exchange crisis, there is the VAT refunds crisis, and of course, a crisis that impacts every industry today, which is the crime crisis, Mr. President. That crime crisis. Let me move quickly onto the port crisis, Mr. President. You see, businesses continue to suffer at the ports as several shortfall cause delays and therefore unnecessary rent and demurrage incurred. Last year, I warned this Senate about the understaffing and the lack of support that existed with the workers at the port, Mr. President, and it has gotten worse since then. Let us look at what the country is seeing today, and I want to quote the Guardian report on October the 3rd in an article entitled, "Port operating at limited capacity after workers walk off the job." That's this month, Mr. President. This month, The workers who have been frustrated by broken promises over the last 2 or 3 years have reached their breaking point. This government has spat in the face of unions, Mr. President. That is what they have done. And now the business community has to suffer for this failure. Mr. President, I remember it was the Coover Point Lisa's Chamber of Commerce that put out a press release on October the 10th this month, highlighting that the container examination station for Port of Spain has been down for more than 5 weeks because of a rat infestation. You hearing that? So it's not just schools now, Mr. President. Is the port have rat infestation? Mr. President, workers have been made to operate in inhumane conditions to the point of closure. Mr. President, the breakdown at the port doesn't stop there, because according to Loop article on October the 2nd, 2023, entitled Budget 2024, which was last budget, $90 million for port scanners. Government will allocate, and I quote, government will allocate $90 million for the purpose of procuring 4 container scanners at the Port of Spain port. However, Mr. President, Loop also went on to say on July the 2nd, 2024, that the main pallet scanner at the container examination station is non-operational. So they supposedly put $90 million spent on scanners, yet one of the most important pieces of scanning equipment was down halfway through the year. Mr. President, even yesterday, just look at the newspaper yesterday in the Express. Look at what it says. They still continue to have issues at the port. Under this PNM government, workers are fighting rats. Citizens' goods have to be left stranded on the ports, and businesses continue to be hammered by demurrage and rent. And let me tell you what happens when they have to incur all this demurrage and rent, Mr. President, on food and hardware products. That increases the cost of food and hardware products to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. So the citizens have to pay more money for food, Mr. President. And Mr. President, they have to pay more money for food. Let me tell you, just 2 years ago, we saw the food import bill was just over $5 billion. I could not believe my ears when I heard the Honorable Minister of Finance in another place say that it is now over $7 billion is our food import bill. My colleague will talk about agriculture, and he will tell you why it probably reached there. But, Mr. President, let's move on very quickly now to the foreign exchange crisis in this country. So, this is perhaps the most blatant example of a PNM failure in governance. In the last 12 months, the population has been hit with a number of drastic cuts in credit cards. SMEs have had to cut back because of restrictions on foreign exchange from banks, Mr. President. And facts are a stubborn thing. And the facts indicate, and this is from the Central Bank, that in September 2015, the United National Congress left a net foreign reserves at $10.45 billion US. And as of September 2024, Mr. President, Trinidad and Tobago's net foreign reserves stood at $5.66 billion, Mr. President. So this PNM government has wiped out half of our foreign reserves while debt continues to skyrocket. That's I said, debt continues to skyrocket. So, Mr. President, you can only trust the PNM NPC government to create such a perfect storm. But, Mr. President, many on the other side have misled the public. They have told us that the problem with Forex is because of grapes and apples and online purchases and so on. But, Mr. President, nobody believes the PNM when they yap about these things. Let me tell you what really caused the foreign exchange crisis. A number of things, but I'll tell you the main key ones, Mr. President. Firstly, they could say what they want. The closure of Petrotrin took out of this market $350 million US. That is how much Petrotrin was bringing in foreign exchange every year. You shut that down, it's out the system. Let me tell you what else, Mr. President. Foreign direct investment dried up. Under this PNM, big companies such as ArcelorMittal, such as Lever Brothers, 1/3 of the Point Lisas industrial estate, I think it might be down to half now, has shut their doors, Mr. President, with billions of dollars in foreign direct investment leaving our shores. And I listened to the Minister of Trade and Industry laughing. I hope the Honorable Lady, with very soft hands, laughs when I give her the figure of the FDI escaping this country. I have it.
Give them.
I'm going to give, no, you know something? Let me give it to them one time. Mr. President, let me give it to them one time. You see, Mr. President, it was in 2021. We were the worst in the Caribbean when it came to FDI. We were the worst generation. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development World Investment Report 2024 bears worse news. Listen to this, Mr. President. I had to hold the paper to tell you this. Mr. President, the report reminds us that in 2021, I take it from the report, Trinidad and Tobago drew negative US $935 million in foreign direct investment inflows. In 2022, Trinidad and Tobago again draws negative $913 million in foreign direct inflows. Mr. President, in 2023, take a deep breath. Take a deep breath for this one, Mr. President. The report tells us that in Trinidad and Tobago draw a negative $1.3 billion in FDI inflows. making Trinidad and Tobago, and they stated, the worst FDI performer of all small island developing states in the world, Mr. President. The worst in the world. That is almost $3 billion in negative FDI inflows in 3 years. Mr. President, it's very simple, evil can't create, evil is only ruin. Mr. President, everyone is hurting because of this multi-year foreign exchange crisis, except, of course, the PNM friends and financiers. But the SMEs, individual citizens who are struggling to purchase goods, send their children to school, Minister of Trade, of Tourism, send their children to school abroad, and maybe even to go away to get medical care, Mr. President, right? But Mr. President, I want to tell you the one that hit us the worst recently now, Mr. President. But I told you that there were several crises. But the last crisis, the third crisis, is actually one of the greatest contributors to the foreign exchange crisis we have today. You see, that is the crisis of the VAT refunds in this country. You see, the PNM treats VAT foreign exchange as though, it's not killing any business at all. Their favorite let me tell you, Senator Roberts, you love this one, man. The PNM's favorite pastime is to create a crisis, then use an expensive solution to fix the crisis, and then expect you to praise them for fixing that crisis while creating an even bigger crisis, Mr. President. That's the PNM philosophy. So what we see, as of March 2023, the government was owing $7.8 billion in VAT refunds. Then the minister announced that the government will address this problem by issuing some $3 billion in bonds at 3.15% interest to pay these VAT refunds. Mr. President, for their failure to pay back VAT refunds, the citizens of this country have to pay after 3 years? $283 million in interest. Wow. Citizens have to pay. Taxpayers have to pay for these bonds, Mr. President. Because you see, Mr. President, they have not gotten away from this debt. They have simply shifted the VAT refund debt from the manufacturers now over to the banks who have cashed in the bonds. I like that. That's what they have done, I like that. Mr. President. And what is even worse, Mr. President, is the minister himself in the other place admitted that the payment of these $3 billion, the lion's share, over 80%, was sent to these energy companies. Now, Mr. President, if you understand the way the energy companies work, they sell their products for foreign exchange. They then trade this foreign exchange into the central bank for TT cash to pay their local bills, to pay their staff, XYZ. So that's a very important amount of foreign exchange coming in to our economy. But, Mr. President, when 80% of the $3 billion has gone to these energy companies, they no longer have to change their foreign exchange. So you are literally wiping out above $300 million more US from the economy. That is what you're doing. That is how the crisis happened or was exacerbated last year, Mr. President. And not just me alone, I listened to other chambers like AmCham speak about this. Energy sector companies speak about it. In fact, the Honorable Minister of Finance even admitted in the other place that this caused a problem. I want to read it for you, Mr. President. I want to read it for you, Mr. President. But what I want to tell you is this. But since that $3 billion was paid, do you know earlier this year I came again and asked the minister of where we were with VAT refunds. And let me tell you this, hold on to your seat. Keep telling you, hold on to your seat. It's real rough information, Mr. President. When I asked a question, Mr. President, I found out that in March 2024, VAT refunds went back up to $6.5 billion. You hearing that? $6.5 billion.
Went back up.
And when I asked the Minister of Finance what he would be, what would the government do to implement a proper management system to alleviate the problem of this heightening VAT refunds. Here's what I said, Mr. President. It was on March 25th, by the way. I planned this time, right? I asked, does the government have a new substantial formula that will help to regularly pay off the VAT refunds so it stops this continuous climb back up to $7 billion, which it probably is right now? You know what the Honourable Minister's response to me was? We are actively working on that. That was it. That was his response. Mr. President, So I demanded a plan of this because without VAT refunds, this is akin to a government taking an interest-free loan from manufacturers in this country. Mr. President, an interest-free loan from manufacturers who need this money, SMEs who need this money to be able to expand and invest in their operations, Mr. President. But then, Mr. President, the Minister of Finance went in the other place.
Senator, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Minister of Finance went in the other place and announced another bond for the exact same purpose. I couldn't believe it, Mr. President. For the exact same purpose and the exact same amount. And what is odd that the Minister gracefully acknowledged the damage that the previous bond did to the foreign exchange and comes out again to offer yet another bond of $3 billion. Now we have to pay another $200-something million in interest, Mr. President, and create another foreign exchange crisis in this country again. That is what we heard, Mr. President. Mr. President, you know, I'll tell you something. I want to run along here now because I was going to talk about crime and its impact on trade and industry and the fact that business people now have to pay so much more to move money, to pay for cameras, to pay for security, and some of them have to pay a ransom, Mr. President, when their sons get kidnapped by people dressed as police, Mr. President. But I will leave that till the end. I want to touch a little bit on tourism. I have to touch on tourism before I go, Mr. President, because I heard the Minister of Finance boast about tourism. Mr. President, after this government has spent $2.5 billion in tourism, I want to give you, the minister said tourism is going great, we are robust. Let me remind them, Mr. President, in 2015, Mr. President, air and sea arrivals, and this is from the CSO, under Kamala Prasad Bissessar, amounted to 442,000 persons coming to our shore in 2015. But under this government in 2023, remember, with excellent work being done by this government, that dropped to 310,000, Mr. President. That is a 30% decline in tourism under this government today, Mr. President. So they're doing fantastic. They're doing fantastic, Mr. President. They lost 10,000. They have 10,000 less arrivals from the US and from Europe today. Less foreign exchange into our country, Mr. President. What is the plan they have? The grand plan of coming with a new airport wing that they're boasting about. And the minister playing smart and telling us it's $800-something million for that airport when we know he had to pay $3 billion to move people off their land. So it's $1.2 billion that went into that project, Mr. President. We must never forget that. I have the article here. I don't have the time to quote it, but that's what it is, and I stand by that. Mr. President, so no matter how much they do to build, they could build 2 or 3 airports. They could waste $400 million on Hilton Hotel. They could put $56.6 million to fix up the hotel for one of their friends and financiers to come and take it and hoist a flag on it, right? Mr. President, they could come and try to fix the problem with the CAL pilots who are striking so that they could get flights to go into the Tobago Carnival. I see 2 Tobagonians here. They're hoping for them pilots to come off so we could get the Tobago Carnival. They could spend all the money on all these grants. But, Mr. President, unless you deal with the problem that impacts trade and industry, that impacts agriculture and tourism, that of crime, you will not see growth of tourism in this country, Mr. President. And I'll tell you why, Mr. President. Quite simply, when we go and we look at the US immigration website, the Canadian IRCC website, and the UK government page, you see travel advisories all over the world that are putting damning reports on us, Mr. President. So that impacts our ability, Mr. President, to bring people into this country for tourism, to bring them for carnival, Mr. President. So as I close, Mr. President, crime is a central problem in this country under this PNM that's impacted the 3 pillars of diversification that they have boasted about: trade and industry, agriculture, and tourism, Mr. President. And I want us to quote what the Ernst & Young chairman, Wade George, said, where he actually echoed the leader of the opposition, the next prime minister, where he said, and I quote it to you today, "There can be no prosperity without safety and security," Mr. President. So, Mr. President, as I end now, and I wrap up, Mr. President, I want to wrap up with words from another era. And the Minister of Finance will know this, Mr. President. Mr. President, this budget presentation is vacuous. This budget presentation is tenuous. Mr. President, it is frivolous. It is vexatious, Mr. President. It has no basis and no purpose. It is absurd, Mr. President, and I refuse to continue, Mr. President. I am out of here. And if your name man or you call the elections now, I thank you, Mr. President.